unmute yourself and just ask the question. So there's 4 parts to the exam, and I'm going to go over each of those parts and kind of help you think about how to prepare. The first part is just you're going to answer in short response, so less than a paragraph, to a student question of that list that I provided on the website. Part 2, you're going to look at these 2 cases pretty carefully, and this is going to be the most similar to the work you've been doing all semester, and you're going to this time be on the Supreme Court, and you're going to be reviewing the Ninth Circuit court decision. And then part 3 is going to be pretty brief, but you're going to talk a little bit about just how you changed your mind, or how you started thinking differently about the judiciary and then law, and then what that might say about what non-lawyers might need to know if they don't get to go to law school or come to criminal justice classes. And then part 4 is a practical application of the Fourth Amendment and thinking about policing. So, part 1. These are the questions that are going to be on the exam. So if you want to take a picture or a screenshot, I'm also going to put this recording on YouTube and then share over Blackboard. So the first question a student asked was essentially getting at, why do you think DeLand used basketball to explain the key of law? So you want to go back to the article, and he explains that in the first couple of pages. And the second one is looking at, it's a nice analogy that they've used here. If you think about dominant people as being able to use their either skill, their size, their money, their influence to their advantage, you want to be able to explain in this question how they do that. So you want to try to be as specific as possible to the instruments of law. So how could they influence the judicial process, and how could they influence the legislative process? But then also, what can they do if they were sued or if they were arrested? How would they be able to defend themselves in a way that would be different than weaker people or poor people? In the third question, this one is asking you to think about where would you find the right to ban the Confederate flag? Would that be from one of the amendments? Would it be from the Constitution itself? Or would that be through a political process? The fourth one is thinking about the Black Lives Matter article and then trying to bring in present day scenarios. So if you think about hate crime legislation, for example, how might that apply to the penalty phase, but then also how might that apply to a protected class? So I'll give you a clue on this one. You'd want to be looking at the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause and think about how a law, let's say in Congress or even in New York City, might use that language to provide more accountability through harsher penalties for folks who harm people of color and then other protected classes, which could be based in religion, in gender, and just kind of think about it that way. So it'd be kind of enhancing the penalties. And then going back to key of law, they want you to think about how you can apply this to a different situation. So there's similarities. The scholar here went to the street courts to just kind of watch and see how people constructed rules. You would want to think about what are other places that you could go outside and see this kind of rule making, rule enforcing, and these kind of processes. And then finally, when you think about that day-to-day activity, how can you expand that concept to think about the key of law as, let's call it the ideology or the mental model, the way we think about the processes of rulemaking, and hopefully that would kind of go back to what you started out in this class, what kind of ideas you had, and then how this article in particular challenges them. Are there any questions on part 1? You could drop them in the chat too if you had one. Put that over here. Okay, so I'll move on to part 2. So when answering these questions, these are my suggestions if you want to get an A answer. So these aren't your political positions. So this isn't how do you feel about the article or how do you feel about the social problem. It's asking you to respond using the materials and the learning from class. So in legal classes, should is not really something we say. That would be more for, a morality class, right? A religion class, maybe a sociology class. But in these answers, we're looking for what is the most likely legal scenario. So that's where you want to pull in this relationship in the criminal justice system between these 4 parts: courts, Congress, police, and then social groups. How are they interacting? And how does that process explain the consequences of people's behavior? You want to do this in a way that constructs a narrative. So you're telling a story about legal processes and how they affect each of those other parts. Does anybody have any questions on how to construct that answer? Or any thoughts?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the question again? Sorry.
Who said that?
China.
Okay, so which question would you like me to repeat?
The one that you just asked us for our opinion.
Oh, do you have any questions about this answer? This is how you should answer those first questions.
Oh, okay. No, that's pretty much how you've been wanting to work, the whole semester.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes. So, at this point, you should be mostly repeating what you've said so far. So feel free to recycle answers that you've used in other assignments. I know not all teachers let you do that, but I think that's a good idea in this class.
Would this fall under the part where you asked us to compare what we thought law was to what law actually is? I see your note not to put the political position, not to use the word should, and I feel that definitely falls under me a lot. How I was in the beginning of class versus now, where I understand that it's not what we perceive it to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I would just add the 2 early assignments where you asked people about the Amazon case and asked them about human nature. Judges and lawyers, we're always in the middle, right? So we can't go around telling everybody what they should or shouldn't do, because at the end of the day, nobody would pay us, right? So people want lawyers and judges to solve conflicts of which there's 4 or 5 people or 4 or 5 different groups who have different definitions of what should be. And so politics, that's for the political arena, right? Not for the legal arena. So the way I would think about that then is, part 2 and 4 here. So you're a part of a social group. So you have a political opinion, right? And that's the best place for you to talk about that political opinion. You shouldn't go around telling police what you think they should do or shouldn't do, unless, you don't mind getting arrested, right? Protesting, I think some people think that the Black Lives Matter protest is actually directed at police, but it's not. If you pay attention to the writing on the website and what the leadership has said, that's actually targeted to Congress. So once your social group is kind of unified in what they want their political position to be or what they want the world should be, they should direct that to Congress. Then the courts, right, have this very narrow perspective of what rights do you actually have. So once 2, 3, and 4 have realized what they want the world to look like, then the courts can mediate between those interests. But the court can't tell these other groups what they should do. Or in other words, if lawyers and judges tried to tell these 3 groups what to do, none of them would listen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions, or should I move on to part 2? Part 1's probably the most straightforward, so I don't assume you'll have questions on that one. And I think China, you're right. Like basically the 2 readings are asking you to read them with the information that you've gained up to that point.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I got out of it. To be honest, I just had to reread The Keys of Law again, because that felt like in a week where I had like a lot going on, so I wasn't really able to focus on the reading as much. So I definitely want to reread that again before the final.
Yeah, and I think, if you're transferring to John Jay or you're transferring to another college, you're going to be reading articles like that more and more. So getting into the habit of reading things 2 or 3 times and reading them differently. So the first time I read an article, I kind of skim through it, and then I take a few notes, and then maybe a few days later I go back and I look at specific parts, right? And I just study parts. I don't need to read the whole thing again, right? I just need to read parts that maybe were complicated.
Yeah, definitely. That's pretty much what I do. And I take a lot of notes and highlight, and then that helps me with my assignment. When I go back, I can just elaborate on what I have noted on the side.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so part 2 kind of then builds on that beginning, right? Is that by part 2, you should have seen very clearly that there's no such thing as one legal rule. There's many legal rules. And so, actually I'll pause for a second, right? There's many legal rules for 2 reasons. One is no situation looks like the other situation. So, your life is different than my life. So there's no rule that's going to rule us all. So we're all going to have different experiences. We're going to bring different issues to the legal process. And so the rules are going to be particular. Now, that doesn't mean that there's 300 million different legal rules, right? We do have things in common. So, some of you have worked in retail. I've worked in retail. So we would have similar problems in a retail environment, or I've also worked in construction. So those would be different in those environments, right? But we'll have workplace similarities. We'll have family similarities. We'll have tax liability similarities, right? There'll be similarities, but each of our lives will kind of present unique challenges. So the courts are responding to kind of these challenges. So I've given you 2 pretty contemporary cases that present the biggest, 2 of the biggest issues. So in this big debate about policing, as you continue to study this, I imagine for several years, I thought it was important for you to be introduced to a Supreme Court case, Scarity versus New Jersey, that reminds folks that police officers, people talk very loosely. Lawyers don't talk like this, and neither do judges. We don't go around saying things like police and civilians. That's pure nonsense. Police are civilians. They are citizens. They have rights. So they should be held to the same standard, but they should also get the same rights as everybody else. So this case really helps you understand, putting police kind of back within the community as opposed to separating them. Which, if you take Professor Chapman's class in policing, he'll show you a video in which one of the police chiefs who was using that language all these years ago, the thin blue line, they're thinking maybe it was a mistake. They should never have used that military metaphor for U.S. policing. The other case is Texas versus Lawrence, which is a fascinating case on a few different issues. But what it does is it extends the right to privacy beyond the married relationship. So there, for 100 years, there'd been a right to privacy to married couples. That was then extended to married couples and their doctor. And then in Texas versus Lawrence, this extended kind of pretty much to anyone. So your intimate sexual identity is protected under the Constitution and under the Supreme Court. So you're going to get a fact pattern where these two things get complicated. And you're going to try to construct rules from those two cases. So the idea here is it's 3 parts, and this is what you've been practicing the whole semester, whether you realized it or not, is that the legal rule is based on judicial cases, right? It's not, I think some of you, when you first started this, you thought you were making up from a legal rule from thin air. That's not impossible to do. And some of you might have got lucky. You might have thought about a legal rule and then it turned out to be in a judicial case. That kind of shows you that DeLand and the Black Lives Matter article are so accurate, right? We made legal rules, judges and lawyers, through cases from human experience. So of course you're going to be able to construct some rules. The difference is now the way you articulate them, the way you argue them. You're kind of restricted as a lawyer or a judge to use the reasoning from those cases to support the rule. So you could say something like, everyone has a universal right to health care. In fact, you've heard probably 100 politicians say that. The problem is there's not a single judicial case that makes that claim. And it's nowhere in the Constitution, and there's no constitutional amendment to support it. So as a lawyer or a judge, we simply just couldn't make that argument without borrowing from either universal human rights, maybe the European Union. I mean, we'd have to look somewhere else on the planet to bring that rule in. So really, it's not, you start off looking for one case, but then you start to see multiple cases. And so you kind of support your rule using 3 or 4 cases. So it's really important in Texas versus Lawrence, they must list 12, 15 cases. You don't have to memorize all those. You just need to be able to see how those work. So one case builds on another case, builds on another case. And that's what ultimately, gives us all our personal right to privacy. In Scarity versus New Jersey, this is the similar process. There's a series of cases that lead up to explaining why police officers should be able to have the same rights as everybody else. And then the conclusion just follows a very simple formal logic. If you ever get to take that class, it's a tight construction. So your legal rule, the case arguments that you're making, and then the conclusion should be a natural conclusion. It should be obvious that the principle that you're talking about, like the right to privacy, that should be obvious by the cases that you put forward. And so we're really looking at in this, and this is something I worked on with Professor Grace Trotman. We kind of identified by looking at all, a ridiculous amount of materials from John Jay and other places, that the 4th and 14th Amendments are the 2 amendments as criminal justice majors you're most often going to come into contact with. So this final exam is really getting you to explore the broad, almost vague language in both of those amendments. And so the court has had to try to narrow down what those things mean over time. And that's what you're really going to be playing with. And I'm going to give you a legal opinion that I wrote as if I were the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then you're making your decision based on that decision. So you're also mimicking being on the Supreme Court. So now you should kind of, and Yolanda had asked me this several weeks ago, to explain this process. And I gave you an explanation visually, but now you'll have an explanation by doing it. You'll have started out at the trial court, you went up to the appeals court, and now you're going to be sitting on the Supreme Court. So you've gone to the 3 different levels. In fact, I play around with this one by having it start in state court and then it moves to federal court. And that brings us all the way back to our first week when we were talking about that with Amazon, and how the Amazon lawyers and the New York Attorney General were playing a game almost, to use the key of law metaphor, to decide, are they going to be in state court, which would obviously help the New York Attorney General, or would they be in federal court, which would help Amazon? And so you see, by the way, that's called venue shopping, if you ever wanted to know that, where you kind of think about where you want to bring your case. The most famous of venue shopping is the Brown versus Board of Education case, which was brought in 13 different states, which was a very smart, strategic move by Thurgood Marshall and his team. So does everybody kind of get how you're going to be practicing, and you've kind of been working up to part 2? Are there any questions on that? These are the moments I miss the classroom the most, where I can read your body language. Good to go. Okay.
Oh. Sorry.
No,
I'm just
fine.
like processing, because like you said, like this class, I wish we had it in person, because I feel like it would be totally different.
Yes.
Pretty much we just had to break down the case, and then just like in a way as we're the Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, and I made it super easy for you by, I'm kind of joking. 4 of the justices are voting one way, 4 are voting the other way, so you're the tiebreaker. So no pressure, no pressure, right? You just have to decide which side you want to be on. And then, what I'm really looking for is that you're able to
according to the legal rule, that's the trick there.
Yeah.
Like the LJ case with the medical.
Yes, exactly like that. Right.
Okay.
I think the difference is that, one of our fellow students she's a nursing major, right? So that case really appealed to her emotional side. For those of you who are interested in law enforcement, this case will appeal to your emotional side. So you have to try to separate your political position, what you want to be the case, right, from trying to be a judge. Judges don't get that luxury, right? They don't get to just say, well, I don't really care what the law says. This is what I want it to say. So you have to practice saying, what's the fair outcome? What's going to be the most balanced approach?
Okay, I'm good now. I just want to make sure, because like we're not in a class, so.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Other students will appreciate that question too. So that kind of brings me to part 3. And in my mind, right, after you've done part 1 and part 2, part 3 will probably be pretty easy. So, you kind of, every single human, no matter who they are, including first-year law students, right? We come into the world thinking that we have a pretty good definition of what we think the legal system is, what the judiciary is, what federalism is, and that's because we had some textbook, right, at some point in our life that gave us the definition. We heard about these things on TV or from our family and friends, and so we thought those things were universal. We thought those definitions were more or less what everybody believed. So those first 2 assignments I gave you were to show you what's called the social construction of law, is that those things aren't universal, right? People have widely different opinions on what they think human nature is, what they think good is, what they think evil is. And the Amazon case is a pretty great example of, I think we all feel that Amazon took advantage of their employees during the COVID situation. And I think that could go for a lot of people who were working during this time, including professors, including us. We were taken advantage of. So, one way to think about that in the first box is that, in real life, resolving social conflicts takes years. On TV, right, it takes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. And now on YouTube and on social media, it takes 32 seconds, right? So um, our representations of what we think law and order is not anywhere near what reality is. So I think, we go through this kind of idea of life is that, we think because I said so, that's why. Then we go to school, and it's like we're all, we're in this diverse world. We're all going to get along. Everybody just needs to follow the rules. And then finally, you get to be a teenager, and if you don't follow the rules, there's going to be punishment, right? And that's kind of the story that we're led to believe that that's what the law is. So I tried to complicate that right away by giving you the basics of the New York courts. If you go to that website again, you'll see that almost none of it has anything to do with the criminal law. So it has nothing to do with this. Most of it is, quite trivial and boring to most people. But that's largely what lawyers and judges do, are trivial and boring things. Your tax returns, divorce proceedings, insurance claims, also IDs, notary publics. There's so many different aspects to law, right, that have nothing to do with crime. In fact, crime is such a small percentage of the law that it's hard to really talk about it much, right? Because on the media you see it every day, but in real life, you're not being assaulted every day. Hopefully not. So when you think about just the description of the court, we're really just talking about procedures and roles, right? So there's a bailiff, there's a clerk, right? There's all these positions, and those are all things, right, that you can apply to after you get your criminal justice degree. But what's if we were in person, we would have done this a lot more. We would have practiced, looking at the forms, filling out the forms, all that kind of fun stuff, so that you'd start to get used to those procedures. And so you see that there's I think before I went to law school, I'd go to a place like the DMV and I'd get super frustrated, right? Or filling out my financial aid form, I got frustrated. After going through law school, you learn that there's a reason for these forms, that you see all the problems that would occur if the forms didn't exist. So that kind of leads us then into the problems, right? And that's mostly what judges do. If all goes well over here, you go back to your life. But if things don't go well, now we're over here. And so what you've seen is, judges don't have a standard that everybody follows. There's no manual. That's because the laws conflict. And so we call that the conflict of laws. It's hard not to criticize Congress and legislatures as a lawyer or a judge, because the laws they write are terrible. The 14th Amendment is just so awkwardly written, it's impossible to really understand what on earth it's trying to say. Even the citizenship clause is super confusing. There seems to be 4 parts to citizenship. In politics, people, they focus on were you born here? And I guess now they're looking at birth certificates. But it's not at all what the law says. The 14th Amendment mostly talks about jurisdiction. So if you're subject to the jurisdiction, then legally you're supposed to be a citizen. So that would apply to any single human that's on the soil, regardless of where they were born. And so, that creates a conflict, right? So unless Congress wants to change the 14th Amendment, or they want to change the immigration laws, then judges are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's, what does the law say? Everyone's a citizen. What do politics demand? Not everybody gets to be a citizen. So there's 2 totally different worlds there, which then leads to stare decisis. In my constitutional law class, we would talk about cases like Scott versus Sanford that declared that folks of African descent could never be United States citizens. That case was never overturned. And so, in theory, you could use stare decisis if you wanted to be a racist exclusion person. And I think the Hawaii versus Trump case comes pretty close to that. So stare decisis is not set in stone, right? You look back to previous cases, but you don't have to use them. You can overturn them. So Plessy versus Ferguson being overturned by Brown versus Board of Education is a pretty good example. Roe v. Wade overturning several cases before women had the right to reproductive services is a good example. Lawrence versus Texas overrules cases. And this is really what legal reasoning is it's about what's the logical conclusion. Congress is very rarely logical. And same thing goes for politics. It's mostly what's called pathological. It's appealing to people's emotions and getting them riled up. Law, on the other hand, is trying to calm people down. So then I kind of moved you over to those injustice topics where I wanted you to see that you could write to a judge so that the judge would start thinking about how they should process their legal reasoning, right? Because judges are often limited because they don't really spend much time out and about with the people. Part of that is because of their class, right? They're economically removed. They have enough money. I mean, they're not super rich, right? But they make more than enough money. But part of it is the nature of the job, right? Lawyers and judges, I mean, we spend 80% of our time reading. And so it's impossible to read at a party, in my experience. So you're kind of disconnected from the people. Now, good judges go out. They go out and amongst and they try to find out, what's going on. But there's obvious limits to judges doing that. The other thing that's hard for students, I think, to understand, but a lot of lawyers and judges take this for granted. We think that everybody knows this. And this really comes out in the Black Lives Matter article. When people pour into the streets and they start demanding their rights, that changes the political process dramatically. So an issue that was not in politics, it was not being talked about, there was no traction, nothing changing. When people go out into the streets and they protest, suddenly it becomes into the political process. This tells judges that it's time for them to intervene. It's time for them to go back. So if we go all the way back to this slide, once people start here and they start raising conflicts and they say, we need some resolution, now the courts have a job to do. And so then they look to the law and they look to previous cases and they say, well, what fundamental rights do people have? Certainly people have the fundamental right not to be murdered by police officers. I mean, that's right. It should be obvious. But people weren't making that claim in the 90s, in the late 90s, and the early 2000s. Especially in the early 2000s, right? In the media, you were mostly thinking about terrorism. And so that pushed out issues like Black Lives Matter. Even though these problems have existed forever, they weren't getting attention. And so judges start thinking about things like the economy or terrorism or whatever it is they think Congress and social groups are trying to think about. So that's when you got to these academic articles. And this tells you kind of how to think about the social side of law, right? So going back, so there's a relationship between the courts, Congress, police, and the people, but that's mostly studied by sociologists, criminologists, some legal scholars, but not as many. So this is where we're now turning this into an academic portion of the class. We've learned about the procedures, we've learned about the process. Now it's time to analyze it. And that's something, if you transfer to the 4-year, you'll be doing this most of the time. So then finally, I think it's best that to give you chances to practice for your final grade. So you've been practicing working up to the final exam, and you've been the judge. And I've really enjoyed the responses. And so I just want to remind you, and I think most of you picked this up, is that judging is about the process. It's not about the content. The result is important. It has consequences, but only if it's a difference that makes the difference, right? So the case is only important if it stands out from previous cases. If it doesn't stand out from previous cases, then it just maintains the status quo of what the law is. So part 4 is going to be about, a modern issue that, frankly, I think we're about to see again. If you're, I'm sure everyone's probably paying attention to the subway attacks. So, if you're noticing, the assailants are using knives, which are very easy to hide. And so how would police be able to police the subways? I mean, this is kind of an open question because this is going to be on your exam. I mean, does anybody have any ideas? Do you have any suggestions on what they should do? I mean, just to remind you, it's against the law to carry a 3-inch blade anywhere in the city. So what should police do?
Tricky, like, to say specifically how they should do it. Only like this weekend, I went to Hurricane Harbor, and they don't check random, like, so if you walk in and you're a couple, right, they won't check your bag. But if you have a stroller, then they check your bag. So me and my family were discussing how, like, if, let's say you're a criminal and you bring in something in your bag, that's okay, like that would pass, but a stroller with a diaper bag inside of it, that they check.
Right. I mean, I'm feeling older right now, but I mean, in the mid 2000s in New York, in the subway, they were randomly stopping and frisking people.
I think COVID too has like a lot to do with it too. Like, are they like, they stop people less, I feel like, now because of this whole COVID thing.
I mean, I can interpret from that they don't want to get COVID, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to interpret, Bart, are you, patrol vigilance just being around? I think because when Bill Bratton was the commissioner, and they were largely borrowing this by policies that they brought back from Iraq, the idea is overwhelming force. So that's more or less what they're trying to do, but they're doing it very poorly right now. In the late 2000s.
Defund them?
Pardon?
Doesn't the opposite happen when you defund the police?
No police officer has received less money than they got 5 years ago. In fact, they have more money than they had 5 years ago. So I don't really know what you mean by that. That's one of those political slogans that I find on Instagram, but it's not a real thing. You see what I mean?
I'm not sure. California, or it was like a state that they had pretty much decreased their amount of patrol officers and stuff like that, and their rate in homicide shot up. And so when they, like, on the radio, they were that was kind of like the words that they used. Due to the defunding, the rate of homicides have gone up.
Let me try to answer it this way, if I can. Statements made on the radio would never be admissible in court. So I'm always suspicious of broad claims like that. Let me give you another example. I have friends who police in Seattle. I have friends who police in New York, and I have friends who police in Dallas. One of the ways in which they got defunded was that their overtime was limited. Now, my overtime was limited at Kingsborough. Was I defunded?
No, this just reminds me of, like, this class.
But you see, I mean, and I could also interpret, student performance over the last year has gone down. Is that because Kingsborough was defunded by the state, or was it because of COVID?
COVID.
Right. We also had a rapid increase in unemployment. And for the last 80 years, every time unemployment goes up, guess what? Homicide, robbery, all violent crimes go up. When the economy is good, guess what? Crime goes down. So there seems to be no relationship with the number of police.
Professor again.
Go ahead.
It's a little noisy. I'm sorry, but I just want to point out one thing, and it's more. It speaks more to me and how I feel. Whenever I hear stuff about that, it irritates me greatly, and I try to think rationally about it, and I try to not jump into quote unquote the fight. So the whole defunding thing, where they said we should reallocate resources to fund social workers and people who are not armed to reply to calls of mental distress or whatever. That's what they're referring to. So I immediately want to jump up in arms with this. And I'm gonna be honest. It's most of the work that I did hand into you, that it made me think about me and the people around me and my family and my kids. And immediately it's like people think it's you're not thinking about me as well. So it's an automatic emotional reaction to want to battle somebody when they say something like, well, defunding the police means there's going to be more crime. Reporting the crime, the reporting of crime is different, is given to you by different places. And I think we learned, it might not have been this class, but I learned that reporting by, there's reporting by the police, there's reporting by a national board who does their collection of data. And that's how they pick and choose where they want to get the information from in terms of the funding. So I try not to be emotional. I try to do what you said and think about the law and think about, be rational and separate yourself from it. And that's the hardest part I found with some of the subjects that we had, is separating myself and trying to be most rational as to what's the best outcome.
Yeah, and I think, in a place that spends, New York spends an insane amount of money on the police, and yet spends very little on education. You have to wonder what the expectation is then, right? What is it you think people are going to do? So it's kind of like, the backside to defund the police would be overfund prisons, right? And then what would be the expectation? We're just going to throw everybody in prison.
And the other side of it, it's similar to, is if you, just for what you said just then, because when my kids were very small, I spent a lot of time in the schools, on the PTA until they graduated high school. So in terms of raising money, let's say, whenever I needed to do something or I wanted to get something done for the kids, I have a fundraiser. I try to, promote as much fundraising as possible. So this thing about defunding the police, it's money that comes from somewhere. And how much do you need for X, Y, and Z? And what are you trying to achieve? Like when COVID started to subside a little bit, what's the first thing they did? Sent $1 million device into the Bronx.
Right.
Got everybody aggravated, and that's where, it's like a slap in the face. And that's why I try to separate myself, and it's hard. And
you also,
people don't. Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think, the question is, we took the question into a different direction than I was prepared for, but we went back into this mode of thinking that if we just give these people more money, then they're going to get the bad people over here, and the bad people are bad because we said so. And we're not looking at anything else. And that's what I'm trying to get you, I'm trying to get the class over here to think about when police officers are violent towards people, why would you give them more money? Right? In other words, money is not the solution to this problem, right? Money is not the solution to the subway assaults problem. What I was trying to, I think what, Bart, if I understood what you're saying about patrol vigilance, is that this is back to the broken windows theory, which I'm not supposed to get too deep into this. This is for your criminology class, but the idea is, somebody is less likely to commit a crime in two scenarios. One where citizens feel empowered to police themselves, and two, when not empowered, the police are there to enforce the peace, meaning that there's 10 of them on one. So if a gang is trying to take a street corner, you send 10 police officers and you take that corner back. That was the model in the 90s and the mid 2000s. It's also the same model that they used in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the only way to do that model is to stop and frisk. So we could end the violence in the subway tomorrow if we stopped and frisked.
But then you have the problem of violating someone's individual rights.
Now you have, right, and you have, if we still live in a racist society, then the stop and frisk policies are also going to be racist. So when I said, say that again.
I feel like you said, like, being that right now, if we're talking about right now, right, if we do stop and frisk, I just feel like the amount of police officer to minority violence would just skyrocket again. Like, I think there needs to be faith in, like, the system per se, that if you're going to stop and frisk a black kid, he's not going to end up dead for having a bag of Skittles on him type of thing. Like, if there was faith in the system that much, then yes, you're right. The stop and frisk would prevent a lot of crime. But due to that not being there and the amount of hate and anger.
No, you said it perfectly. That's right. And that's over here in the social groups, right? So this is almost in this order, right? Social groups are policed. Congress funds the police, and the courts enforce this process. So if this process is racist, if it's sexist, then the courts are going to uphold that process until the social groups decide that they want to change it. And that's the go ahead.
I'm sorry. To add to what she was saying, in terms of, okay, we talk about, you hear schools saying we need after school programs for kids. You hear them say we need funding for centers for places for kids to go and things for people to do. If you take recreation or take educational things away from a neighborhood or society, it's going to leave them with no other options of what to do. And when it comes to trying to find money to do things, it's good. If you don't give opportunity, if you don't give potential for growth, potential for getting out of the mud, then that's where, the good faith goes to the dirt. The good faith was lost when you decided you wanted to underfund a whole society, a whole neighborhood, a whole community. When you start doing that, you lost faith, but nobody noticed it because they just think, okay, well, this just happened this year. And then the year after, and the year after, and the year after, and next thing you know, there's a building that's empty because there's nobody able to rent it because they have no jobs or they didn't go to school or whatever it was, they couldn't afford to live there. So everything is within bounds. The same way during the pandemic, they said, oh, don't pay your rent. But they didn't tell the landlord, and we're going to give you unemployment, we're going to give you money to help you. But they skipped over the landlords and went straight to the big businesses. So there was a disconnect between giving money to people who needed it in all these places. It needed to go from the top, forget the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top. Go the other way, and you'll get the little guy and the guy above him and the guy above. The guy at the top doesn't need what the guy in the middle or at the bottom needs. And that's where the disconnect and the lack of faith comes from, for what you were saying.
And you know, this goes back to, you know, it's this goes back to essentially when you think about if the society is unjust, which roles, I mean, this goes back to the student's question. You know, people who have control over the system are going to benefit from the system. And so, you know, to add to what Bart is saying, you know, things are, I hate to be a pessimist here, but things are going to get worse economically. The unemployment claims created a hoard of cash, and those ridiculous loans that the government gave out to big businesses, they decided to not increase supply, but instead to give that money to their CEOs and to reinvest it. And so now you have people with extra money, but there's no supply. And so now we have inflation, which, you know, some of you have to ask your parents or grandparents about what that was like in the 70s. But basically, you'll just keep watching things like milk, bread, eggs. The prices will just keep going up. And so, you know, on the one hand, politicians were saying, we're here to help, but really they're creating a problem further down the line. And then crime always increases when the unemployment rate is high, which is common sense, right? I mean, nobody's shocked by that, right? So now they're going to say they want more money. And they're going to say that they want to go back to stop and frisk. Or they'll find a way of doing stop and frisk without calling it stop and frisk. And then lo and behold, I'll prophesy now, 4 or 5 years, you're going to see more excessive force, more corruption, and then people will be begging for community policing again. So we're just in this vicious cycle. And I want you to be thinking about, what are we expecting cops to do? Are they supposed to solve all of these problems? And who's best situated to try to solve these problems? The courts would probably be a better place to think about these two groups working together. But look how far they are apart. If you don't think the police are in the back pocket of the people who pay them, you know, there's more classes I need you to take. But look, social groups don't get to go directly to the courts. And so that's a big problem. It's a theoretical problem and it's a practical problem. So when you're thinking about these ideologies, if the majority of Americans are mostly just thinking about crime and they're not thinking about their rights, then what do you think cops are going to think about? They're going to think crime and they're not going to think about your rights.
The rights will be lost to over-policing.
Right, and prisoning, right? So, you know, this is the future. So I've walked you through this class, right? And these are our immediate future. In New York, LA, Seattle, Dallas, you know, I think that example in LA, they're ahead of us in that way, right? They're already starting to push back against the defund narrative. In hindsight, I think if we could get the BLM leadership on this call, we might discuss whether defund was the appropriate phrase. Maybe it would have been, maybe there was a better phrase that, you know, could have been used, because it is confusing. I think people are confused by it. And it's a triggering phrase to many people. So I don't think that was the intent.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, like as I hear like Bart speaking, I just think like, because I'm 23, so I just feel like a lot of things I'm learning, I can't just take at like face value. Like I have to like research, investigate, then research and investigate that research. Because like you said, there's so many like false outlets and a lot of opinionated. That's not like, if we were to compare it to like the legal rule. Like there were a lot of things that I thought before this class were a certain way. And now I'm realizing that it's not just black and white. There's more to it that I feel like the government tries to like cover up or like sneak in, kind of like they don't want, it's like information they don't want us to know. Like you have to dig deeper for you to know the true meaning behind it. Like defunding, just off of that word, we think one thing, but now after speaking with you and Bart and stuff like that, it's not what most would think when they just hear the word defunding the police. If that makes sense.
No, it does. It makes perfect sense. I mean, it's actually nice to hear, because I think when Bart and I were 23, right, the Republicans were using the phrase defund education, defund reproductive services, right? So I think the Black Lives Matter people were using similar language because that was the political environment that they were in. And I'm thinking maybe that was a mistake. I mean, in when you study politics and law, there are mistakes. I mean, Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall reflected and thought it was a mistake to go for the Equal Protection Clause as opposed to going for a fundamental right, right? So if students of color had a fundamental right to education, then college would be free today. Whereas the Equal Protection Clause is about discrimination. And so there hasn't been much improvement in resources provided to students of color versus white students, because it's gone now to the private sector. So a lot of what you're saying makes perfect sense, right? Going from 23 to 40 or to 50 or 60, you'll have more time to reflect and think about not so much what the content of the information is, but what's the process. And that's, that's why I said I've heard those same figures that you talked about, but I've heard this before, right? These claims before. And so as you get older, you hear the same story again, and you say, well, I think this time I'm not going to believe the story. But anytime anyone wants to give a fast answer to a very complicated problem, I immediately have to think about, would that be admissible in a court of law? Or would that be excluded? And so, quantitative data, a bunch of statistics, they rarely tell a story.
Very true.
So, you're on the right track. Okay, the only thing I had left for us all we're in penalty time now, was just I feel like you should all know this, because in physical reality we would have talked about this several times, but in virtual reality, I'm assuming your other professors probably aren't telling you these things. But you can find the academic calendar at the KBCC website. It's kind of hard to find, so I would just put it in the Google search, or you could just go to this website or to this web address. But I've given you the details here. So the technical last meeting, which is kind of strange to me in internet land, but is Friday, June 4th. So I'm going to open the exam on June 7th, and you'll have until June 15th to finish it. So you'll have 8 days to get it done. And it's kind of up to you based on your other obligations when you want to do that. Any work that you still need to churn in would need to be done by June 14th. So, a preference would be to your judicial letters if you haven't churned those in, and the final version of that as well. I also posted a couple extra credit opportunities. I think the Fourth Amendment one that I posted today would be good practice for the final exam. So, I think that'd be good for you to do that one. It also kind of gives you multiple views on the Fourth, so you can kind of see it from different perspectives and understand why the police see it differently than a judge or somebody who's being stopped. And then one minor detail is that if you see here, right, grade rosters are due from faculty. That's me. So I have to turn in the roster on the 18th or by the 18th. And those final grades will be on CUNY first, right? So Blackboard is kind of like a guide for you to keep track of what you're doing. Ordinarily, I don't use Blackboard. And the final grade, your actual grade, is on CUNY first. So I'll tell you right now, I've gotten to the habit during COVID of grading on a curve. So, the highest grade is automatically an A+, and then I work back from that way. So as long as you finish your work, right, and you do your best, you'll get a bump on your final grade in addition to the bump you got for your participation and completing assignments. I think that's clear. Are there any questions on that?
Is the final going to be like, when you open it, you have like 3 hours to do it? Or is it just going to be posted and, like, let's say I want to work a little bit at a time, I'm able to do that?
I'm going to put that in my notes. It's a Google form. I think I can set a button so that it saves your work.
If it's like our assignments that we normally get, then that's fine, because that's like, I can work on that little by little. I just wanted to know if it was like, when you open it, you have to do it type of thing, all in one shot, like in one sitting.
I don't have a rule that says it's timed. I just have to. I just don't. My worry is that. So you're saying on the other Google Forms you could stop it and then go back to it?
Yeah, like I'm able to open it, look at the questions, and like type it up and then come back to it later on or something. Like it's not like I have to do it in one sitting type of thing.
Yeah,
it doesn't delete it. Like I leave it open on my laptop.
Yeah, I think and just to, I think part 1 you could answer pretty quickly. I think part 3 you can get through pretty quickly. Part 4 will depend on how you're feeling, right? Like if you feel like you want to write a lot. And part 2 is the one that's going to take, I think, the most time because it's a pretty long fact pattern. I'm probably going to release the fact pattern separately so you could read it, beforehand if you wanted to and be prepared that way. I'm the kind of person that I'd want to get it done in one sitting so I didn't have to think about it again.
Okay, that works.
But if you had to do it in more than one sitting, I would think that you could get part 1, 3, and 4 basically done, and part 2 would be the one that you'd need more time. And if you all could do me a favor and just keep a copy of your answers in like a Google Doc or something, just in case you lose it. Because I don't want you to have to go back and redo everything. You could just email me your answers, if you lose them or something.
I also have a question.
Go for it.
So, can you go back to the last slide, please?
This one?
Yes. So you see it says all work must be submitted by June 14th. Does that count like the work that we missed, like from the beginning of the marking period of the class too?
So any assignments that are closed are going to stay closed.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's what I meant, like from earlier.
But there's more extra credit assignments available than assignments that are closed.
Okay.
So, I haven't gone through the extra credit yet. So that score you see right, on the participation grade. Like it might say 5, 6, 7. I haven't gone through and added all the extra credit yet.
Okay.
So, that's what I'll probably be doing like next week through the final, basically, or up to the 14th, right? I'll just keep adding those points in Blackboard so you have a good idea of how many you had. Now, some people have 10, right? So you can't get more than 10. So you're done. Like you can't get higher than an A+, right? So I think that makes sense. The main assignments, right? The letter assignment is the big one. But the final grade is the largest portion of your grade. Final exam is the largest portion of your grade.
Professor, can you just go over the letter assignment? Because I'm a little confused on what we have to do.
Yeah, 1 second. Are there any other questions about the final exam from anybody else? Okay, so